morning, good afternoon, or good night to those of my students who are staying up till 3 a.m. I see you. I was told that these videos were a little bit too cringy by a couple students, so I will try my best to hold back on being so cheesy. Anyway, where were we? Let's recap what we were talking about last week. That's right, classification.
In 9th grade biology, we're going to focus really on just two small but interesting and pertinent parts of classification. The first thing that we're going to focus on is the 6 kingdoms. And I'll crown myself Classification Kingdom Queen. Dun, da, da, da. If it makes you feel better to give yourself an imaginary crown, do it. Why not?
The reason we're talking about the 6th kingdom is that every single living organism falls into one of these 6 kingdoms, and each kingdom has its own specific traits that help classify or sort the organisms into that kingdom. A nice analogy to this might be looking at my bead box.
What you would notice in this box is that all of these things here are beads, very much like all the things you will be dealing with are living organisms. However, I can sort all of these beads into 6 different smaller containers based on one trait, that being their color. Light blue, dark blue, yellow, green, white, and red. That means if I was ever to get some new beads, I could decide very quickly which container to put it into based simply on that one trait or its color. If I was just to pick up one container, I could know already that all of the beads in this container have that one particular trait, light blue. Concepts will apply for each of the 6 kingdoms. By knowing what traits are particular to each kingdom, we can know where to put a living organism. And likewise, if we were just to look at one kingdom, we would know that all the organisms in that kingdom have these same traits.
Now, the traits to categorize these 6 kingdoms are a little bit more complex than just colors. To help you keep track of this as you go through the video, I have attached a graphic organizer to your Google Classroom assignment. You have a couple options. If you're able to print this at home, I would recommend printing it and just putting it into your notebook. If you're not able to print it at home, go ahead and add this table to your notebook. And you've got 3 different options for how to learn this information. 1, you can follow along with the rest of this video, and I will be filling out the rest of this organizer with you. 2, you can take your graphic organizer and you can look at the PowerPoint that I've attached to the Google Classroom assignment and start to fill in some of that information yourself. And finally, 3, you can go online and find some good resources that have all of the different details about the 6 kingdoms that will help you take notes on this. You choose the method that is best for you, and I will see you around. This video will tend to repeat itself a fair amount, so feel free to skip ahead, skip around, fast forward, rewind as you need.
Here are the beautiful 6 kingdoms. And the 5 pairs of traits that we'll be using to classify organisms into each of them.
First up, we have Kingdom Archaea. Archaea were originally misclassified as belonging to bacteria. They are single-celled prokaryotic organisms, and they're actually believed to be the oldest organisms that were living on Earth. The first class of Archaea that were found were actually called extremophiles because they could live in extreme conditions that were thought to be conditions of early Earth. Things like boiling hot temperatures, super acidic seas, these Archaea thrived there. One example of a crazy Archaea bacteria is a thermoplasmatale. This guy is called an acetophile because he loves acid and can live in environments with negative pH. That's super acidic. A second type of extreme Archaea is something called a methanobacteria. These bacteria can survive in environments with no oxygen whatsoever because they use fermentation and emit lots and lots of methane gas. They fart. They're farting bacteria. That's what they are. Next up, we have eubacteria. The U standing for the true bacteria, because once we found out Archaea were their own classification, we had to have some way to define true bacteria. We learned a lot about these guys in EEE. You know them to be the single-celled prokaryotic organisms that they are. And fascinatingly enough, there is enough bacteria to way outnumber us on the Earth. I'm talking estimates of up to 5 with 30 zeros after it bacteria. That is more bacteria on Earth than there are stars in the universe. Crazy, right? Both of these bacteria are living in you right now. Next on our list we have Kingdom Protista. Kingdom Protista are simple single-celled organisms, but they happen to be eukaryotic. Now, Kingdom Protista is kind of like an everything goes bag. Basically, anything that's single-celled and eukaryotic gets thrown in here. So some of them act a little bit more like plants. They can photosynthesize, and some of them act more like animals. They can actually engulf other Protista and eat them. While you may not have heard of Protista before, you probably have definitely heard about things like amoebas or algae. Both of those are forms of Protista that are living together in multicellular colonies. All right, everybody, fungi is in the house. Fungi, eukaryotic multicellular organisms, talking big picture here, and known for eating dead or decaying things, helping decompose or break down our dead bodies. Not just bodies of humans, bodies of any living things. Because if you think about it, if every single living thing that died was just left here on Earth, we would soon be buried in an immense amount of dead and decaying material. Fungi are extremely important in our ecological system. Some examples of fungi, besides the obvious mushrooms and stuff that lives in your feet when you don't take care of them, would be things like yeast that we use to help break our bread, as well as the good old mold that loves to live on the bread after you've baked it. Moving into more familiar territory, we've got Plantae. Plantae is going to be eukaryotic and multicellular and encompasses all of the plants that you know, from gigantic sequoia trees all the way down to tiny little miniature succulents and blades of grass. And finally, last but not least, the kingdom that just seems to be everybody's favorite. Kingdom Animalia. Multicellular, eukaryotic, normally heterotrophic, so they're going to be eating plants or other animals or a combination of both. Herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. And basically one of the coolest kingdoms around. Why? Because we belong to Kingdom Animalia. Let's do a quick recap to see how much you're paying attention. First of all, we've got one main division between the eukaryotic kingdoms and the prokaryotic kingdoms. Basically the ones who have organisms made of cells that have nuclei and membrane-bound organelles versus the ones whose organisms have no nucleus or membrane-bound organelles and are usually unicellular. That quickly gets us into Archaea and eubacteria for prokaryotes, and Plantae as well as Animalia for eukaryotes. However, what do we do with these last two? Fungi, if you think about it, mushrooms are gigantic compared to a single cell, so they are also going to fall into eukaryotes, whereas Protista, single cell organism, eukaryotic. These guys do have nuclei. So these would be our final standings for eukaryotic kingdoms, there's 4 of them, versus prokaryotic kingdoms, basically the bacteria kingdoms. Take a look at our graphic organizer and start by actually focusing in on the taxonomic level above kingdom, or domain. Archaea bacteria and eubacteria are very special because they each have their own domain. So the domain for Archaea bacteria is simply Archaea, and the domain for eubacteria is simply bacteria. What about the other 4 kingdoms, you ask? The other 4 kingdoms all belong to the domain of eukarya, which, as you can assume, means that all of their cells for Protista, fungi, Plantae, and Animalia are all eukaryotic. On the other hand, our 2 bacteria types are going to be prokaryotic, lacking a nucleus. Next, multicellular organisms versus unicellular organisms. Unicellular meaning they only have a single cell, and that makes up the entire organism. Multicellular meaning there are multiple cells, at least 2, and most likely thousands more in the organism. To classify, yes, the bacteria are unicellular organisms. They only take one cell. On the other hand, things like plants and animals and fungi are much larger organisms, are going to be multicellular kingdoms. What do we do about protista? If you remember from the beginning, protista are single-celled organisms, even though they happen to be eukaryotic. They are a very bizarre brand of organisms. Did you catch that? Archaea and bacteria are both unicellular, composed of one single cell in their organism. Though protistas sometimes like to live in multicellular colonies, each individual cell is still going to be considered one organism or one protista. Means then, of course, that our remaining 3 kingdoms are multicellular. They're going to have multiple cells in their organisms. If you think about it, a fungi, a plant, an animal, these are all going to be much larger than any bacteria. Another trait that we can use to distinguish between organisms in the 6 kingdoms is the presence of cell walls or the absence of cell walls. Now, you might remember already that animal cells are eukaryotic and they normally don't have cell walls, whereas plant cells, while being eukaryotic, do have cell walls that help give them their rigid structure. Think of like a stalk of celery or the trunk of a tree. That leaves us with 4 more kingdoms that we've got to figure out their classification for. Now, if you think back to EEE and when we're designing our antibiotics, bacteria also have a cell wall. Their cell wall happens to be made of something called peptidoglycan, or proteins and carbohydrates. Archaea also have a cell wall, and that is going to be made out of purely protein. The reason why these guys probably evolved a cell wall is because they are extremely vulnerable, being single-celled, simple organisms, and it's best to have that extra layer of physical protection. Speaking of protection, fungi, which are not able to move away from predators on their own, also have a cell wall. Theirs happens to be made of something called chitin, which is an extremely strong carbohydrate also found in the shells of crabs. Finally, last but not least, we once again come to the mysterious kingdom protista. Protistas are very mobile, meaning they move around quite a bit, and as such, do not need a rigid cell wall to help protect them. It would just kind of get in the way. So for cell walls, Archaea bacteria have a protein cell wall. Eubacteria have that peptidoglycan cell wall, which if I look at it, pepti should remind me of proteins, polypeptides. And then glycan probably reminds you a little bit of things like glucose or glycogen. Those would be carbohydrates. So a very strong protein and carbohydrate cell wall. The other kingdoms who have cell walls would be things like fungi. Their cell walls are made out of something called chitin, which is a very strong carbohydrate. And plant cell walls are made out of something called cellulose, which is what gives us all that really good fiber when you eat your veggies. Our 2 kingdoms lacking cell walls and only having cell membranes are going to be protista and animalia. I already started discussing it with the last trait, but we can also categorize organisms into the 6 kingdoms based on whether or not they're able to move on their own. Now, movement helps you a lot as an organism because it helps you to run away from predators, catch prey, move to areas that are safer from natural disasters, and also find resources and food more easily. Basically, there's only 2 kingdoms that are not able to move on their own, and those would be our fungi and our plantae. Remember that these 2 also had evolved a cell wall, kind of to help protect them from those extra stresses of natural disasters and predators. That leaves us with 4 other motile kingdoms, kingdoms that can move around. That would be our animals, our protista, our archaea, and our eubacteria. So motile looks a lot like mobile, and mobile meaning something that you can pick up and take around and carry around. Same idea for these kingdoms. So if you are motile, you are able to move on your own. Non-motile, you can't move on your own. We already know that mushrooms can't walk around, and unfortunately, neither can plants. Other 4 kingdoms can move on their own. They would be considered motile. Whether it's cilia and flagellums that are propelling them, or it might be something like legs, flippers, etc. I'm going to add in this thing called contractile motion. That's just the ability of a cell to kind of squeeze up against its surface and ooze along, kind of how you imagine an amoeba sometimes moving. Leads us to our final category, heterotrophs versus autotrophs. Autotrophs being able to nourish themselves, and heterotrophs having to depend on other organisms for their energy.
Autotrophs make their own food. The best example would be plants, which can make their own glucose purely from energy from the sun. Pretty cool. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, they get their energy by eating others. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that too soon after the bunny massacre?
6 kingdoms, there is only one pure autotroph, and that would be Kingdom Plantae. We know them well for their photosynthesis abilities. Likewise, there are only 2 kingdoms, who are heterotrophs or depend entirely on other organisms for their food. If you think about it, animals are going to have to eat other plants or animals. They cannot get their energy from the sun. And likewise, fungi depend on dead or decaying matter, once again cannot get their energy from the sun. So where does that leave these 3 kingdoms? These 3 kingdoms lie in the middle, where they can both be autotrophs or heterotrophs, depending on the type of species you have in there. So that means that some bacteria are able to produce their own food, whether through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, where they actually synthesize food from other chemicals. And some bacteria and protista are actually going to be heterotrophs, able to consume others or other material from life in order to survive. All right, heterotrophs versus autotrophs. If I actually break down the words, auto means self, like automatic, automation. Troph is going to be Greek for nourish. So autotrophs are self-nourishing, or they're able to feed themselves, i.e. produce their own food. On the other hand, hetero means other, troph meaning nourish. They're going to get their food from others, mostly from the autotrophs. Only true autotroph was a plant because it could do photosynthesis. i.e. using the sun's energy to make his own food. After that, fungi and animalia are going to be heterotrophs. Remember that fungi are going to be the ones who feed on dead or decaying matter. So I'm going to call them a decomposer because they break down dead or decaying organisms. Animals are also heterotrophs. Animals are either going to be herbivores, eating just plants, carnivores, eating other animals, or omnivores, eating both plants and other animals. And then we've got our super special single-celled organisms. In these single-celled organisms, you have both some bacteria that are heterotrophs, able to consume other bacteria or protista. And then you have some very interesting bacteria who are actually able to produce their own food. These guys will use sometimes things like photosynthesis depending on if they have plant-like qualities. This is going to be especially for a protista. They will also sometimes use something called chemosynthesis, in which they take other chemicals and are able to convert them into glucose to use. That is something that is actually especially true of Archaea bacteria. So the special characteristics being that Archaea are some of the oldest, they're considered the oldest living organisms. They're also known to be extremophiles. Philes meaning loving. So they love extreme environments, whether it be acidic or really hot or really cold. They absolutely love and thrive in extreme environments. They're like the adventurers of the animal. They're like the adventurers of the kingdoms. These guys are like the ones who like to live on the edge, you know? Those people who just go out and jump out of planes. That's how I imagine Archaea bacteria to be. The examples I gave you were methanobacteria, the ones who use just fermentation and farted a lot, and thermoplasmatales, the ones who can live at negative 0.06 pH. Eubacteria are considered the second oldest living organisms in the world. And then there are, of course, some that are not so great for you. Things like Vibrio cholerae. I'm gonna spell this wrong. Cholerae. I'm not a Latin expert. Vibrio cholerae, like the ones that cause cholera. That's some of the groups for EE we're studying. Protista are cool to me because while they are single-celled, they also tend to have characteristics of plants and animals. Special characteristics of fungi, probably the best thing about them is the fact that they're decomposers. There's no other kingdom with organisms that help eat up other dead or decaying material for us. So they serve a very vital function in the world of life. I'm not sure I have a very special characteristic of plants other than that they're extremely diverse kingdom. Examples, let's talk about things like pine trees. Let's talk about things like garden carrots that you tend to eat. Let's talk about things like magnolias. And finally, animals, or kingdom Animalia. Kingdom Animalia is interesting because it probably has the most diverse shape, potentially, competing with plants for that. Most diverse like physical characteristics within its kingdom, right? Because within the kingdom you have everything from tiny insects all the way up to giant whales. You've got your mammals, you've got your reptiles. There's a very vast and interesting array of organisms within kingdom Animalia. Let's see, I want to put in kangaroos. Clearly emperor penguins. And you know what? Skunks, because why not? All sorts of things like lizards, spiders, jellyfish, and crabs. If I were to tell you something like this animal is eukaryotic, it has a cell wall, and it is known to help decompose organisms, you can probably start to limit yourself down to things like, it's in the kingdom of fungi. Likewise, if I told you that I have a eukaryotic unicellular organism, the only kingdom that fits these two characteristics would be Protista. So your organism falls into the kingdom Protista.
And that's it for today, guys. You should be able to complete your practice now. It's on Google Classroom. It should be fairly simple. It's basically categorizing different organisms into these 6 kingdoms based on the traits that I've given you. There is one section where I ask you to use a dichotomous key. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but if you have trouble with that, I'll be uploading a video by Tuesday on how to read a dichotomous key. Stay safe, stay well, and I hope if you have mastered this concept completely, that you will make yourself a small crown as the ruler of the 6 kingdoms.